Hi, how's everybody doing? Feels a little like coming to the lion den, you know, some biologists coming to talk, some astronomers, but we were actually talking about this the other day, and we were discussing what it's like to come in right after the break. But Blake brought up the fact that, you know, if we're going to give a theoretical biology talk to a bunch of astronomers, it'd probably be best if they have a little bit of booze in their system.
All right, so let's get into it. This is called Life from Lifelessness, Terraforming Planets. My name is Blake, Astrorock'n, and Rolland, and this is Eric Quasar. Let's get into it. What is terraforming? So terraforming is the process of making an inhospitable environment suitable for life. The first serious consideration of this was proposed in 1976. Some NASA scientists said, okay, what are the extremophiles that live on our own planet, and how would they stack up to the hypothetical ideal Martian organism? The hypothetical ideal Martian organism requires no oxygen. It has extreme resistance to ultraviolet radiation. It has extreme resistance to drying, and it grows very fast. If you look at the microorganisms, they're green algae, lichen, moss, blue-green algae, also known as cyanobacteria. None of them really quite fit the mold, but you would ask how we would use these microorganisms to go to another planet, and I would answer you, I'm going to have to science the shit out of this.
So speaking of the Martian, what exactly do we know about our closest neighbor? And actually we know quite a bit. It's about a little bit more than half the size of Earth. And thanks to previous missions such as Pathfinder and Curiosity, we know that the surface temperature is roughly negative 55 degrees Celsius. The atmosphere is composed of about 95% carbon dioxide with trace amounts of nitrogen, oxygen, argon, and carbon monoxide. We also know that the gravity is about 0.38% that of Earth. And I kind of just want to bring this picture back because I think it's hilarious that Pathfinder took its own pose for a picture while Curiosity took a selfie. Now, in more recent news, we also know that the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter recently discovered possible evidence of flowing water on Mars, and the European Space Agency and the Russian Space Agency, as of last month, just launched a mission called ExoMars, which is going to be a two-phase mission. One's going to be an orbiter that's going to look for signs of methane and other trace gases in the atmosphere, and the other will actually be a rover which will land on the surface and perform surface experiments, both of which will be targeted at searching for evidence of life on Mars.
So, with that in mind, we're going to go back to terraforming. What is terraforming? How can we make Mars, that's going to be the basis of our talk, how can we make that more hospitable for life? Terraforming is also known as planetary ecosynthesis, and it's basically rationally designing environmental parameters like temperature, humidity, and atmospheric pressure. So, how would you do that on Mars, you would ask? One of the proposed methods is introducing perfluorocarbons into the atmosphere, effectively warming the atmosphere to make things a little bit better for the environment. Another proposition is to do orbital mirrors around Mars, which would heat up the ice caps, which are made of 95% carbon dioxide frozen and a little bit of water in there. So another proposal was by Carl Sagan, and he proposed introducing like black sand into the ice caps, so it would absorb more heat and melt them. There have been a little bit more irrational ways to do this. Elon Musk, last year, I want to say, during a late night television show, he said that he wanted to nuke the ice caps of Mars, which it would work. It would work. And so he kind of reneged on that and kind of explained it a little bit more thoroughly. And whenever he was saying it in his defense, he was saying it would be the quick way of doing it. What we're proposing is the more sane way of doing it. He wants to basically what he wants to do is pulse nuclear bombs, make mini stars on the planet, above the planet, to kickstart the atmosphere. Which, I mean, it's something. It's an idea.
It is something. So now that we've kind of discussed what terraforming is, let's take a step back and actually ask the question, what is life? Now, life is described as the condition that separates animals and plants from inorganic material. Now, that can include reproduction, growth, and continual change preceding death. In this specific instance, we will describe life as being able to metabolize and use organic material, as well as releasing gases into the environment.
So what do we know about life as it exists on Earth? We kind of have to go back to that question. Brace yourself. So what do we know? The earliest confirmable evidence of life was 3.5 billion years ago. Interesting to note is that this is around the time period where Mars is thought to have been a little bit more Earth-like. What we know is that these fossils here are showing us windows into our Earth's geological timescale. So what these are imprints of how the microorganisms interacted with the environment. And what we can do is compare these old chemical reactions and how they interacted with the environment to make these different structures with contemporary microorganisms, and really extrapolate what these microorganisms are doing and what they were doing in specific time frames of geological history. So what would these early microorganisms look like, you might ask? They would look exactly like we know them now. But the major difference is that they would be in an anoxic environment, which means that they have to take up oxygen, or not oxygen, it's anoxygen. It has to figure out a way to take up electrons and donate electrons. And the way it does this is through chemical processes with rocks, geomicrobiology, and also using light for energy for turning it into a biochemical usable energy.
So we've kind of just touched on what the first step would be. So the first step would be to kind of take temperature and pressure on Mars and put it into a more stable state. After we've done that, pretty much the next step would be to then inoculate the Martian surface with organisms to begin the biological restructuring of the planet. Now we're going to touch base on about 4 organisms that we believe would be ideal for this purpose, but I kind of want to stress before we start that ideally we would be sending a cocktail of organisms that would all work symbiotically in order to survive the harsh environment. Now, what's widely regarded as one of the most successful organisms on Earth to date is known as cyanobacterium. It actually used to be called a blue-green algae, but it's actually a blue-green bacteria, which is something that we've found out recently. Cyanobacterium is really awesome. Basically, it is a bacteria that photosynthesizes, so it gathers most of its energy from the sun, converting it into usable chemical energy. Now, you can see from this image up here that a cyanobacterium cell is very similar to a chloroplast in structure. It has a lot of the same cell structure, and they both, like I said, they both photosynthesize, producing energy from light. Now, it's believed that cyanobacterium is is responsible for one of the major oxygenation events on Earth. Now, another really cool thing about cyanobacterium is it requires virtually no feedstock, and it's believed that it may be able to carry out nitrogen fixation with available atmospheric, chemical, and water resources already on Mars. Now, for those of you that don't know what nitrogen fixation is the process of turning inorganic nitrogen into reactive nitrogen species, which can then be used by organic processes. Another really cool thing about cyanobacterium, so I think these are really cool, and I don't think I'm just biased because I'm a microbiologist. I think that this is actually pretty interesting. So another really cool thing about cyanobacterium is that they are what's called polyploidal. Now, for those of you that don't know, polyploidal means that they have multiple copies of their genome. Now, this does 2 really convenient things when you're trying to send an organism to Mars. First, it makes the organism incredibly resistant to UV. The reason is because if one of the chromosomes gets damaged by ultraviolet radiation, then it can basically reverse engineer the damaged section from the other section of that chromosome. The other really cool thing that you can do with polyploidal microorganisms is it's with using current advances in biotechnology and molecular biology, it could be possible to actually genetically engineer these microorganisms to better survive the harsh Martian conditions.
So, after you inoculate with microorganisms and kind of make the environment more hospitable, you can start to introduce an evolution of complexity. And by that I mean lichens. Lichens are relatively simple organisms, but what they are is they're a mixture, a symbiotic mixture of organisms. What it is green algae. It could be cyanobacteria, which we were just talking about, and they grow symbiotically on a filament of a fungus. And they can do some really interesting things, and they live in really extreme environments because they build these processes, and through the evolution of all three of them together, they can really do some amazing things. So what does that mean? That means that we can rationally design these lichens to symbiotically work together in a way that would be beneficial towards an end goal, which would be making a soil more soil-like. Lichens are really interesting because they secrete an acid, an organic acid, into rocks, and they break them down, making minerals, which then, you know, they're the food stock for other things to grow. They grow in the harshest environments that we know. They're what are found on the edge of where the polar ice caps are on Earth and where life begins. And that's why we really look into them for insights about how life would grow in a place such as that. The other organism that goes along with this is algae. Algae's extremely interesting, and I didn't know it until we started looking into it for this talk. Its astrobiological significance is that it can pretty much utilize frozen water to grow, and it did that through a pretty nifty way. It's a green algae technically, but it's red, as you can see. The red is a specific pigment. Yeah, that's a weird thing. Blue-green algae turning into bacteria, and green algae being red algae. But this specific pigment of red, it blocks a specific wavelength of UV light to protect the genome. And a secondary effect of that is that it absorbs heat, so it can live on frozen ice. And whenever it absorbs heat, it melts the ice that it's in contact with. And that's pretty interesting because that's just a nifty way to utilize the environment around it. The really cool thing about algae, there's a lot of cool things about algae, is that it evolved to use hydrogen in anoxic environments in such a way to protect itself, but also to kind of the thing about algae is that it can take gas and it can use hydrogen as either an electron donor or an electron acceptor to bring CO2 into simple carbohydrates, which again further the food stock of all of the rest of the organisms that are symbiotically working together.
So at this point, we've successfully inoculated the planet with microbes. So it's time to introduce a little bit more complex life. So we think that the next organism to send to Mars after this process has been complete would be moss. Now, moss is pretty interesting. You're going to hear that a lot from the biologists talking about life. But moss is pretty interesting because it can actually sequester a large amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and then put it into what's called biodegradable resistant biomass. So essentially, what you're going to do is you're going to scrub the atmosphere of carbon dioxide and then put it into this place that's going to resist decaying. Moss also produces a large amount of oxygen and may have done the same thing on Earth during the mid-Ordovician era. So at this point, we have several microorganisms and other simple forms of life that have now began to kind of generate an ecosystem that's becoming more stable. But something else that you have to consider is that on Earth, we have these nifty systems called the carbon, the oxygen, and the nitrogen cycles, which basically transfer inorganic material to organic material. Now, this is something that we would have to do on Mars as well, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. As you can see, photosynthesis can produce organic carbon. You can take atmospheric carbon to put it into photosynthesis to produce that organic carbon. Organic carbon is then used by respiration, which releases atmospheric carbon dioxide, but then it gives you biological energy and so on and so forth. So it's important that you establish these cycles. Now, many of the organisms that we've mentioned can actually do a lot of this stuff, but at the same time, it can actually be detrimental to their growth. So at this point is when we kind of need the engineers to come in and potentially give us some kind of industrial means to actually work on that. But you know, let's not forget that life finds a way. So, at this point, we now have a stable ecosystem on Mars. We have growing organisms, and we have a good cycle of inorganic material to organic material. So the next question you might be asking yourselves is, when can Mark Watney grow potatoes on Mars? So, the Mars atmosphere contains roughly 0.1% oxygen. We'd have to bump that up to about 2 to 6% in order to grow rooting plants such as rice and corn. So, you know, we have organic material being introduced into the environment, and we have oxygen, but where the hell are we going to get water? Are we going to get it from the rocks? Well, actually, yeah, we are. So according to a professor from the University of Arizona, there are certain areas of Mars, such as the Molasse Chasma, that are actually very rich in polyhydrated sulfates. Now, polyhydrated sulfates are materials that contain up to 50% water. And according to him, if you heat these up to about 150 degrees Celsius, you can actually literally extract water from rocks, which is really convenient because it's really expensive to ship water to Mars.
So, what will Martian farms look like? Your guess is as good as mine at this point. The plants could be really tiny, the microorganisms could be really big, but still small. You still couldn't see them. But what would it look like? So one good way of predicting this type of thing is to look at where contemporary agriculture stands and what we're doing on Earth to push that forward. One of maybe the infrastructure might be there for what are called vertical farms, which are basically a contained ecosystem in vertical layers that is pretty much sealed off from the environment from the outside. But what if we could make one of these that had microorganisms in it that were already growing on the way to Mars and have it off gas the right kind of chemicals into the atmosphere that would bring it would kickstart the atmosphere, and that's what we're really trying to do. That's what Elon Musk proposed with the whole nuking Mars thing, and it's terrifying. Like there's so many ethics behind Mars and space travel in general that we can't. I don't even want to talk about it because it's a thing, and it started back in 1966 whenever we were trying to go to the moon. So. With that said, venturing into the future, it's scary, but in a way we're kind of in control of our own destiny because we can rationally design these things to be what we're looking for. And the pursuit of such a lofty goal, the knowledge gained wouldn't go to waste. And it's something that a lot of people can work on together to bring new and fresh ideas into all kinds of innovations.
Thank you.
All right, so we're going to have to share a microphone for the Q&A. We have one quick question from Twitter, which is, so many great examples of humans introducing species into new places on Earth. What could possibly go wrong doing it on Mars?
Exactly.
You know, that doesn't really sound like a question to me. That sounds more like a statement. But what I will say is that, you know, it is something that is going to be very difficult to achieve. We're not pretending that this is going to be easy. And in fact, this is something that's going to take a very long time. Current estimates are that designing an ecosystem like this will take roughly about 1,000 years, which sounds like a really long time, but when you consider the fact that this took 3.8 billion years on Earth, I think that's relatively fast.
Okay, more questions down at the front here.
Just to elaborate on that point, because that was going to be my question. You're saying 1,000 years to design the ecosystem. Does that mean from first algae to living there?
So it's difficult to say because we really don't know how these organisms are going to react on Mars. They might not produce oxygen as efficiently as we think. There's going to be less gravity. So that's a pretty optimistic estimate. But yeah, basically it'd be from step 1, melting the ice caps, to step 15,000, having human colonies on Mars surviving off of rice that's been grown there.
Down here. Yeah, in the middle.
So I thought part of having part of a problem of having an atmosphere on Mars was that it wasn't massive enough, so you'd lose gas into space, and also Mars isn't geologically active, so wouldn't a good solution be crashing Phobos and Deimos into Mars to make it more massive and a little warmer?
Well, that would shake things up a little bit, yeah. What's that? Oh, he asked what would happen if we crashed the moons into Mars to kind of kickstart things. That could happen. I'm pretty sure that's a novel idea.
Elon Musk might be giving you a call.
Oh yeah.
Okay, in the orange shirt.
Yeah, if you do go to Mars, it turns out there is pre-existing life there, and you terraform that planet and oxygen there. It's quite possibly going to lead to a mass extinction,
Much like the ones that happen on Earth, yeah.
So the question is, if you go all the way there, a ship to terraform Mars, it's a big effort. You show up in this life, do you think it's worth the genocide of the planet?
That's a good question.
So you bring up a really good point. So what he's saying is that if there's already life on Mars and we basically take a ship out to Mars and find out that there's life, is it worth it committing basically what amounts to a mass genocide? Now, that's actually been taken into consideration. There's actually an international treaty that was signed in the 1960s by pretty much every single spacefaring country. And one little clause of that treaty is that you cannot intentionally contaminate any kind of astrological bodies. So any kind of rover missions or anything like that that goes to Mars undergoes a thorough sterilization. Now, what we are going off of the assumption that Mars is a dead planet, and we will have more information on that once the ExoMars program kind of kicks off, and we kind of assume that we're not going to kind of just forget about Mars and lose interest. So if it turns out to be life there, then it might be worth it to preserve that ecosystem, so that way we can study how life has basically arisen in other places in the universe. But if it's a dead planet, then why not?
Okay, so we are out of time, so let's say thank you again to our biologists.